The night after her husband's funeral, Evelyn Carter discovered a hidden door in her own home. A door her daughter never knew existed. A secret her late husband had buried for decades. And the only thing standing between her and losing everything. But by then, it was almost too late, because earlier that same day, while Evelyn was still drowning in grief, her daughter Lydia had already taken control of the house, the finances, and every decision that followed, moving with a quiet efficiency that didn't feel like love, but something colder, something calculated. And Evelyn, at 74, too exhausted to question it, too broken to resist, simply nodded through the conversations, signed the papers placed in front of her, and trusted that her only child would never truly harm her, not after everything, not after a lifetime of sacrifices that Lydia had witnessed firsthand. From the years Evelyn worked double shifts to pay for school, to the nights she stayed awake during fevers, to the countless small ways she had built her life around her family, believing that in the end, that love would be returned. But grief has a way of clouding judgment, and Lydia knew that. She used soft words and careful timing, choosing the days immediately after the funeral, when the house still smelled of flowers and condolences, when Evelyn's mind drifted in and out of memories, when reality felt distant and heavy. And that's when she began introducing the idea that the house was too much now, that it was unsafe for Evelyn to live alone, that it would be better for her to move somewhere with care and supervision, a place where she wouldn't have to worry about anything. And each sentence sounded reasonable on its own, but together, they formed a quiet push towards something Evelyn didn't fully understand yet. And when the documents came, thick and official-looking, Lydia didn't give her time to read them properly. She summarized them instead, quickly, confidently, pointing to where signatures were needed, reassuring her that it was all just standard procedure, that it would make things easier moving forward. And Evelyn, still wearing black, still waking up every morning expecting to hear her husband's voice, didn't argue. She trusted, because trust had always been the foundation of her family, or at least, that's what she believed. Until 3 days later when strangers walked into her home without knocking, carrying measuring tapes and clipboards, speaking in low voices about renovations and layouts as if the space already belonged to them. And Evelyn stood in the hallway watching them, confusion slowly replacing the numbness of grief, until she finally turned to Lydia and asked, in a voice that barely held together, "What is this?" And Lydia, without hesitation, without even a hint of guilt, replied, "The house has been transferred, Mom. It's already in process," as if she were discussing something minor, something inevitable, and the words didn't make sense. At first, transferred, process, they felt distant, technical, until the reality settled in like a weight pressing down on her chest. This wasn't a discussion anymore. It was done, finalized, and suddenly everything that had felt like support revealed itself as control, every gentle suggestion as a step toward this exact outcome. And Evelyn realized, too late, that she hadn't just signed papers, she had signed away her home, her stability, her last connection to the life she had built. And when she tried to speak, tried to ask why, Lydia interrupted her with the same calm tone, explaining that it was for the best, that the house was being sold, that arrangements had already been made for Evelyn to move into a senior residence, a place Lydia described as comfortable and secure, as if that could replace decades of memories, as if comfort could be manufactured without history, without belonging. And Evelyn didn't argue, not because she agreed, but because the shock had taken her voice, because the realization that her own daughter had orchestrated this so quickly, so completely, left her with nothing to hold on to. And so she was given a week, just 7 days to pack up a lifetime, to sort through drawers filled with photographs and letters, to decide which pieces of her past were small enough to carry forward, and which would be left behind forever. And Lydia didn't help. She said it would be too emotional, though the truth was simpler. She had already moved on, already shifted her focus to what came next, leaving Evelyn alone to dismantle her own life piece by piece. And each object she touched carried a memory that made it harder to let go. A chipped mug that reminded her of quiet mornings with her husband, a coat still hanging by the door that smelled faintly like him, a photograph tucked behind a mirror that captured a moment when everything felt whole. And by the final night, the house was no longer full, It echoed, empty spaces replacing what once felt warm and lived in, and Evelyn walked through each room slowly, not just saying goodbye, but trying to understand how it had all slipped away so quickly, how trust had turned into loss without her even noticing. And when she reached the back hallway, a part of the house she rarely thought about, something made her pause, a small, almost invisible detail that felt out of place in her mind. A door, narrow and painted the same color as the wall, something she had passed countless times without question, without curiosity, and yet now, in the silence of that final night, it felt different, like it was waiting, like it held something she had overlooked for years, and Evelyn found herself staring at it longer than she intended, trying to recall if she had ever opened it, if it had ever mattered, and strangely, she couldn't remember, not clearly, only a faint, distant memory of her husband once mentioning that part of the house, brushing it off as unimportant in a way that hadn't matched his usual nature, because he had always been careful, always deliberate, never dismissive without reason. And as Evelyn stood there, surrounded by the quiet aftermath of everything she had lost, she felt something shift inside her, not grief, not anger, but curiosity, a small, persistent feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was something in this house that hadn't been taken yet, something Lydia didn't know about, something that had been hidden in plain sight all along, and for the first time since the funeral, since the papers, since the strangers walked through her home like it was already theirs. Evelyn reached for something that wasn't given to her, something she chose for herself, and slowly, almost cautiously, she stepped toward the door. Evelyn didn't sleep that night, not really, because the moment her hand brushed against that narrow, forgotten door, something inside her refused to settle, as if every quiet instinct she had ignored for years was suddenly awake again, and by morning, while the rest of the house stood half empty and unfamiliar, she found herself searching, not aimlessly, but with a strange sense of direction she couldn't explain, moving through drawers she hadn't opened in years, lifting old boxes, checking places that made no logical sense, driven by a memory that was more feeling than fact, until she stopped at her husband's desk, the one thing Lydia hadn't rushed her to pack yet, and for a moment she hesitated, her fingers resting on the worn wood, because that desk had always been his space, organized in a way only he understood, private without ever needing to say so, and opening it now felt different, like stepping into a conversation he had never finished, but something pushed her forward, and she began going through it slowly, carefully, until her hand brushed against something unexpected beneath the surface, a slight unevenness under the desk's underside, and when she leaned down to look, her breath caught, because taped discreetly where no one would casually notice was a small, aged key, its metal dull with time, but unmistakably intentional, and in that moment, the faint memory returned more clearly, his voice, years ago, calm but firm, telling her that some things in life didn't need to be explained immediately, that understanding would come when it had to. And back then, she had smiled and let it pass, trusting him without needing answers. But now, standing alone in a house that was no longer hers, those words felt like something else entirely, something prepared, something meant for this exact moment. And without giving herself time to overthink it, Evelyn stood, key in hand, and walked back to the narrow door in the hallway, her heartbeat steady but heavy, each step carrying the weight of everything that had led her here. And when she reached it, she paused just long enough to realize that whatever was behind it could change everything, or nothing at all. But either way, she needed to know, and so she slid the key into the lock, the metal turning with a quiet, almost reluctant click, and as the door slowly opened, a faint rush of cool air met her, carrying with it the stillness of a space untouched for years, and what revealed itself wasn't just a small storage area or forgotten corner of the house, but a narrow staircase descending into darkness, and Evelyn stood at the top, staring down into it, her mind racing with questions she didn't yet have answers to, because in all her years living there, she had never once come down these steps, never once thought to ask what lay beneath her own home. And yet here it was, hidden in plain sight, waiting, and after a moment's hesitation, she reached for the light switch along the wall, her fingers brushing against it before she pressed it down, and one by one, dim lights flickered on below, revealing a space that made her grip the railing just to steady herself, Because this wasn't a basement, not in any ordinary sense. It was something far more deliberate, far more complete, a fully built apartment concealed beneath the house. And as Evelyn slowly made her way down the stairs, each step felt unreal, like she was walking into a part of her life that had existed without her knowing. And when she reached the bottom, she stopped, overwhelmed by the quiet detail of it all. A small but functional kitchen neatly arranged, a bed made as if it had been waiting, shelves lined with preserved supplies that, despite their age, had been carefully stored, a sitting area with a chair and table placed with intention, and even electricity, still running, casting a soft glow that made the entire space feel less like a secret and more like a plan. And that's when it became clear to her that this wasn't something her husband had built impulsively or in fear. This was something he had prepared with time, thought, and purpose, something he had chosen not to share, not because he didn't trust her, but because he understood something she hadn't yet realized. And as Evelyn moved further into the room, her eyes searching for anything that might explain why, she saw it. A single envelope placed neatly on the wooden table, her name written on it in his handwriting, steady and familiar. And for a moment, she couldn't bring herself to touch it, because that handwriting meant finality now. It meant words she would never hear spoken aloud again. But slowly, with hands that trembled despite her effort to stay composed, she picked it up and opened it, unfolding the paper inside as her eyes moved across the lines he had left for her. And with each word, the pieces began to fall into place, because he wasn't just explaining the apartment. He was explaining why it existed at all, telling her that he had built it over years, quietly, carefully, ensuring that it remained separate from the main property in every legal way that mattered, that it was registered solely in her name, untouched by anything that could be transferred, sold, or taken without her direct control. And as she read on, the truth settled deeper, heavier, because he had anticipated this. Not the exact details, not the timing, but the possibility that one day, someone might try to make decisions for her, might see the house not as a home, but as an asset, something to be managed or divided. And he had refused to leave her vulnerable to that, even if it meant keeping this from her until the moment she needed it most. And when she reached the final lines, her vision blurred with tears she hadn't allowed herself to fully feel until now, because what he had given her wasn't just a hidden space. It was a choice, a way to remain independent when everything else had been taken, a place no one could force her out of, no matter what papers had been signed upstairs. And for the first time since Lydia had told her the house was no longer hers, Evelyn felt something shift inside her, something steady and certain, because while the rooms above might already belong to someone else, this space beneath it, this quiet, carefully built apartment, still belonged to her. And as she folded the letter and set it back down on the table, she realized that she wasn't as powerless as she had believed. Not yet, not completely. And as the sounds of distant movement echoed faintly from above, workers continuing their measurements, unaware of what existed just beneath their feet, Evelyn made a decision that didn't come from anger or defiance, but from clarity, because instead of leaving that day as planned, instead of stepping into a life that had been arranged for her without her consent, she would stay, not in the house they had taken, but in the part they had never known existed. And as she looked around the apartment one more time, taking in the quiet proof of her husband's foresight, she understood something that Lydia did not, that sometimes the most important things aren't the ones people see or claim or fight over, but the ones hidden just out of reach, waiting for the moment they finally matter. For 3 days, Evelyn lived beneath her own house without anyone knowing, moving quietly through the hidden apartment as if she had always belonged there, listening to the muffled sounds of footsteps above her, the voices of workers discussing changes to rooms that once held her memories, the steady rhythm of a life being rearranged without her. And yet, down below, everything remained still, untouched, hers. And there was something strangely calming about that contrast, as if the world that had rejected her existed entirely separate from the one that still held her in place. And she didn't rush to act, didn't confront Lydia or try to undo what had already been done, because for the first time since the funeral, she wasn't reacting anymore. She was observing, understanding, waiting, And it didn't take long for the first crack to appear, because on the fourth day, the voices above changed, no longer casual or routine, but tense, confused, edged with frustration, and Evelyn paused. Mid-step, her attention drawn upward as fragments of conversation filtered down through the ceiling. Words like records, ownership, and discrepancy repeating in uneven tones, followed by a sharper voice insisting something wasn't right, that the property details didn't align with what had been disclosed. And Evelyn stood still, her breath slow and controlled, because she already knew what they were discovering. She had read it in the letter, understood it in the quiet certainty her husband had left behind. This apartment wasn't part of the house Lydia had transferred. It had never been. And now, that truth was rising to the surface in the only way it could. Through confusion, through legal complication, through a problem no one had anticipated because no one had thought to look deeper. And by the end of that day, the house above had shifted from a place of confident ownership to one of uncertainty. And the next morning, Evelyn heard the front door open with a force that carried urgency rather than control, followed by footsteps she recognized immediately. Quick, sharp, familiar. And moments later, Lydia's voice echoed faintly through the floor, no longer calm or composed, but strained, demanding answers that no one seemed able to give her, asking how something like this could have been missed, how there could be a separate unit listed in records that hadn't been included in the transfer. And the reply she received only deepened the tension, because there was no simple explanation, only the undeniable fact that a portion of the property, small but legally distinct, had never been hers to take. And for the first time, Lydia was facing something she couldn't control with paperwork or persuasion. And Evelyn, listening from below, didn't feel triumph or satisfaction, only a quiet sense of balance returning, as if something that had been tilted too far in one direction was slowly correcting itself. And she waited until the voices above settled into uneasy silence before making her move, not out of impulse, but because she understood that this moment, this precise intersection of confusion and realization, was when the truth would land the hardest. And so she walked to the staircase, her steps steady, her posture calm, and for the first time since discovering the apartment, she opened the door not to enter, but to reveal. The faint creak drawing attention from above almost instantly, and within seconds, Lydia's footsteps approached, hesitant now, uncertain in a way Evelyn had never seen before. And when the door swung wider and Lydia appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression shifted from irritation to shock so quickly it seemed to freeze there, her eyes scanning the space below as if trying to make sense of something that shouldn't exist, something that disrupted everything she thought she had secured. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them carrying more weight than any argument could, until Lydia finally broke it, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier authority, asking a single question that revealed more than she intended. "What is this?" And Evelyn met her gaze without anger, without accusation, simply answering in a tone that was steady and unyielding. "It's mine." And those two words landed with a finality that no explanation could soften, because they weren't just about the space itself. They were about everything Lydia had tried to take, everything she had assumed was hers to decide. And in that moment, the dynamic between them shifted. Completely, not through confrontation, but through clarity, because Lydia understood now that despite all her planning, all her careful execution, she had overlooked something fundamental, something her father had ensured would remain beyond her reach. And the questions came quickly after that, layered with disbelief and frustration, asking why she hadn't known, why it hadn't been disclosed, why Evelyn hadn't said anything. But Evelyn didn't rush to answer. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make one thing clear. This wasn't something that needed to be justified, and when she finally spoke, her words were simple, measured, carrying none of the emotion Lydia might have expected, because it wasn't yours to know. And that was when the weight of it truly settled in, because the situation upstairs, the sale, the transfer, the plans Lydia had set in motion, were no longer complete, no longer secure. Everything was now tied to a property that was legally divided in a way that complicated ownership, restricted changes, and required acknowledgement of a space that couldn't be removed or ignored. And for Lydia, who had approached everything with certainty, with the belief that control could be established through decisions made quickly and quietly. This was something entirely different, something that required her to face the limits of what she could take, and Evelyn didn't need to argue that point. She didn't need to demand anything or force an apology, because the situation itself had already done what words could not. It had drawn a line that couldn't be crossed, and as the days passed, the house above remained in limbo, plans delayed, conversations complicated, while below, Evelyn settled into a rhythm that felt steady and real, not hidden, not diminished, but grounded in a way she hadn't expected. And Lydia returned a few times, each visit quieter than the last, her presence no longer carrying the same authority, her words more careful, as if she were navigating something fragile rather than controlling it. And Evelyn listened when she spoke, responded when necessary, but she didn't yield, didn't step back into the role that had been decided for her, because she no longer needed to. And in the end, what remained wasn't a dramatic reconciliation or a complete separation, but something more subtle, more lasting, a shift in understanding that neither of them could ignore. Because while Lydia had taken the house, the documents, the visible pieces of what they once shared, she had never truly understood where the real power lay. And standing there in the space her husband had left for her, a space no one could claim but her, Evelyn realized that she hadn't just found a hidden apartment. She had found the one thing that couldn't be signed away, transferred, or taken in a moment of weakness, her independence. And that, more than anything else, was what her daughter had never expected to lose.